intro work. So welcome, good morning from the West, good afternoon from the Eastern time zone. Welcome to Rainbow Ecosciences 2022 Plant Healthcare webinar series. I'm going to go over a couple housekeeping slides and then I'll introduce Dave. So just wanted to let you know that we are new name, same dedication to science and service. So for those of you who know us as Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements, we rebranded to Rainbow Ecoscience, just a little bit easier to say, but we're still here for you. We're still the same folks. So if you see that name change, know that we're the same people. We didn't get bought, nothing like that. Quickly, as a core value for us, safety is one of our main goals always. So just having you guys do a quick safety brief, check your surroundings for any trip hazards, things like that, depending where you are in the country. Make sure you're aware of any inclement weather in the forecast. For those of you who may be driving, you're welcome to listen as you are in your vehicle, but if you are going to be actively watching and things like that, we ask that you please be parked in a safe location, pull off and find a safe spot to be. I'll introduce myself, even though I'm not giving the talk. My name is Allison Harrell. I'm the West Coast arborologist with Rainbow Ecoscience. We have a handful of us now of arborologists, this fake word, but basically we are special arborists. We have a special title that Rainbow has given us, and we serve you in training and education and healthcare protocols. We do a lot of hands-on training with staff out there, technical support, and backup for product and equipment stuff. I'm a certified arborist, track certified, just submitted my applications for my RCA, have a biology degree from Valparaiso University and a master's in environmental science from Indiana University. But that doesn't matter because Dave is really going to be doing the talk today. So for Q&A, type your questions into the Q&A box, please. So if you type into the chat, that's fine. If you just want to banter, if you have comments, that's great. But the Q&A box is the only place that I will actually see your questions when we're going to do the question section at the end of the webinar. This will be recorded and a link will be sent out. Dave has so kindly offered to give us a PDF of his slides as well and a couple of supplementary materials. The webinar is worth 1 ISA CEU. Okay, so please listen here. You should have put your ISA number when you signed up for this webinar. If you didn't, please type that into the Q&A box now. But if you did, you don't need to do it again. And then we will put up the ISA code at the end of it, but we are going to submit these for you. So when we give you the code, you're not submitting that. All it is that you have it for your records. If you have questions on this, please let me know. Okay, without further ado, it is my honor to introduce Dr. David Coyle. So Dave Coyle is an assistant professor at the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation at Clemson University. His extension forestry program focuses on forest and tree health and mostly invasive species management in both natural and managed landscapes across the Southeast. He has a BA from Luther College, biology, a master's in entomology and forestry from Iowa State University, and a PhD in entomology from University of Wisconsin. He is the past president of the North American Invasive Species Management Association and is on the South Carolina Invasive Species Advisory Committee and the Advisory Committee for South Carolina Exotic Plant Pest Council. That's a mouthful, Dave. So the important thing about Dave is that he's my favorite insect-fluencer. This is the term that I have coined for him. So please follow him on social, Twitter and Instagram. He has awesome content. He's at Dr. Dave Coyle, one of my favorite follows for sure on social. But he posts a lot of really cool informative stuff there. His research activities are kind of around methods for invasive plants in forests, evaluating bark beetles, which I think he's going to be talking about today, and then investigating a lot of information with the Asian longhorned beetle. So just a wealth of knowledge. So he has so many more things on his bio, but without further ado, I will let Dave take over from here. So the title of his talk is They're Not Boring, the Ecology and Management of Common Wood-Boring Tree Pests.
Thanks, Allison. That's the first I've ever been called an insect-fluencer. So still processing that. Appreciate it.
You gotta like
All right.
trademark it.
All right, everybody, welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Dave Coyle, and let's talk about some wood borers, shall we? So before we get into everything, I've got a lot to tell you today. A lot of it is grounded in hard knowledge, hard published information. But I have been doing this type of thing for over 20, 25 years at this point. I've got some opinions. I will certainly give those when I feel appropriate, and I will make sure you know those are indeed opinions. So first of all, I think one of the main things I want y'all to know is that invasive wood borers, something that is non-native to this country, for instance, if it's invasive, it's a primary pest, means it's going to kill healthy live trees. Those are very different from a lot of our native wood borers, which are almost always just secondary pests. What are secondary pests? You might be asking yourself. Well, those are things that simply respond to a tree that is stressed. The big theme of this whole talk today is if you keep a tree happy and healthy, you're probably not even going to get the borers. The borers are going to come to something that is stressed, showing signs of weakness. Maybe it's injury, maybe it's kind of a long-term drought type of deal, but that is the whole key, is stressed trees attract a lot of these borers. Now, when we look at things, especially in the urban environment, these trees are facing an uphill battle pretty much from day one. There's all sorts of issues with trees in the urban environment. They're getting different amounts of precipitation and rain. I mean, look at all this impervious surface here, right? It's not like the rain's just going to soak down into everywhere. Sometimes these surfaces create flooding. You can have wind tunnels just based on where buildings are and where trees are. There's also all sorts of pollution, whether it's in the air, the water, just the gunk that people tend to drop on the ground in some of these areas. And all these things work together and tend to give trees, it makes them a lot more palatable and susceptible to a lot of different pests. And on top of pests, you've got people, right? People are one of the worst things that happen to trees in some cases. And then even beyond that, you've got different temperatures in urban areas as you do in some of the natural areas. So first of all, if you don't use the drought monitor or know of the drought monitor, I would strongly encourage you to do that, droughtmonitor.unl.edu. And this just gives you a broad overview of the states in particular, as far as where drought conditions are happening. So this shows you that most of the Southwest and West is dry. If you live over here in the East, you know it is not dry because it's been raining for days and we just want it to end at this point. But this is just a very good overview. And then moving into, the temperature, if you look at cities and places where there's lots of impervious surface, this is things like concrete and asphalt, those are things that attract and absorb heat, not attract, they absorb heat. And you know this, if you take your shoes off in the middle of summer and you walk on your lawn and then you walk across your driveway, it's a lot warmer on your feet when you're walking on the driveway, right? So when you look at an urban area with a lot of those impervious surfaces, you're going to see hot spots where there are those surfaces. Now, one thing you're not seeing in those little hot spots is these are things like parking lots. So there's probably a tree planted somewhere in there and a little 4 foot by 6 foot chunk of dirt. So these trees, compared to their counterparts out in the woods, it's a lot warmer. They're getting heat coming down, heat radiating up, and that heat tends to stress trees. Now, how does that work? There's a lot of scientists, a lot of really smart people have done a lot of really good work to look at how climate change and increasing temperatures and that type of thing affects trees. I will boil it down here for you. The gist of what happens is that when it is warmer and when the night temperature stays warmer than historically, you have more water loss from tree leaves. Traditionally, trees would use nighttime as the time to sort of catch up on their water, right? They keep it in and they suck some up from the soil, but when it's warmer, they just keep losing water out of their leaves. So you've got more water loss. When it's really hot, photosynthetic rates decrease. And this is basically just the tree's response to being very, very hot. It tends to just sort of shut down and sort of just sit there. So when it's really hot, photosynthesis decreases, which means it's not making as much energy as it could for itself. And on top of that, when it's that hot, it can't store as much reserve energy. And all these things are very important because trees need that reserve energy to fix themselves when they are wounded, to reflush in the spring when it's bud break, or to reflush after any type of defoliation event. So all these together just mean that most of these trees in urban areas are stressed just by being there. They are automatically stressed. Now, Put on top of that, there's things people do like this, volcano mulch. Please don't do this ever. And if you see someone doing it, let them know this is not the way, right? So all this is doing is creating a whole bunch of moisture at the base of that tree that's going to attract fungus, okay? On the other side of that, you've got things like soil compaction. This is super common along sidewalks, parking lots, that type of thing, where people are always walking on it. There's also exposed roots when the water tends to wash away soil like that. And then there's also just the physical damage that happens when people hit the trunk of a tree with a weed eater per se, or maybe even a lawnmower. This is why we encourage folks put some mulch around the base of that tree and give it a little space so you're not constantly whacking on that thing. I know today is insects, but some of these issues at the base of trees is the biggest reason we have bud and root cankers and fungi, as those fungi get in those spots and tend to wound those trees. And if you live in a college town like we do, people are one of the biggest stressors to trees you can have. Our city horticulturist says that the biggest threat to urban tree health in Clemson is 18 to 20-year-old males on Saturdays in the fall. I suspect this is true in many such college towns because people, at the end of the day, they tend to see trees as something they should hang on or swing on. And you get a lot of inadvertent rip pruning, as you can call it. So lots of physical damage. So the moral of all this background story is that you've got this perpetually stressed tree. This is the life of a tree in an urban environment. Now let's talk about insects real quick. Okay, so these are ectotherms, which means as the outside temperature goes up, their inside temperature goes up. Pretty simple, right? Outside, inside, everything is linear, right? So as it gets warmer in the summer, they grow faster and they grow larger. And then this is what this means. It's not just that they can have more generations through, it's that they can have more generations, but also consume more. So this was a really cool study, I thought, where they looked at how different caterpillars respond to an increase in temperature, okay? So let's look at the very hungry caterpillar. Those of you with small children, you know what I'm talking about. So you've got 3 little hungry caterpillars that all start at the same spot. And the ones on that top box, they were raised were at 66 degrees during the day, 61 at night. You've got 2 nitrogen levels. You can kind of ignore that for now because the temperature is the main thing on this graph. And then the bottom caterpillar was raised at 77 in the day, 72 at night. Doesn't seem like a whole lot, right? 6 degrees or about 10 degrees difference, 11 degrees difference. But look what happens. The top caterpillars, they are still going to reach maturity just fine. It's going to take them about, 8 weeks or so, but they will certainly get mature. As you raise that temperature, they're not only getting mature faster, but they're also getting larger at maturity. And then, by the end of it, you've got something that's basically growing to, fulfilling that life stage in half the time, and they're getting much, much larger than they did beforehand. So what does all this mean for the trees, especially those in those urban environments? It's safe to say that most urban trees are stressed, both physically and physiologically, okay? And it's also safe to say that most tree pests are only going to impact stress trees. Now, of course, there's exceptions, but in almost all cases, those exceptions are invasive species. The urban tree environment, or in some cases, poor management. I have stand management, but if you're in charge of an urban forest, whether it's a park or like a causeway, that type of thing, this is basically an urban forest, and that's what we consider a stand. So any type of poor management there is going to give you this perfect storm of stress factors on that tree. And then the result is usually what gets called tree declines, but most likely there's pests involved there too. All right, let's hop into some of these certain different pests. Ambrosia beetles, first of all, hundreds of species of ambrosia beetles out there, very, very common. They are common in every single place you can think of. They are practically like dust out there. They're in forests, they're in nurseries, city squares, your yard, the park, suburbia, golf courses. Really, they are just all over the place. So ambrosia beetles are essentially everywhere. These things are very small. They're very diverse in terms of morphology and hosts they will use. And some of them can do a lot of damage. Ambrosia beetles are not eating anything living on that tree. They are just using that tree as a place to dig a house, is how I think about it. So the adult females will burrow into that tree or that shrub. And then they have on their body, on here, elytra, their head, they have these little pockets called mycangia. that just carries these fungal spores. Each ambrosia beetle species has a specific type of fungus it carries with it. As it jigs those holes, the spores get on the inside of that gallery and they start growing. And you can see in this slide, you've got that, blackish white, basically fungus growing on the inside of that gallery. And that is what those larvae of the ambrosia beetle will eat. So that is what they're doing. They're not eating the tree. They're just kind of making a home. One of the telltale signs for ambrosia beetles, particularly in hardwood trees and shrubs, are these toothpicks or noodles, or frass tubes, we sometimes call them. This is a combination, and each one of these little tubes is where one adult female has gone in. So this is what we call mass attack. Each one of these little tubes is comprised of sawdust, maybe some fungal mycelia, and beetle poop. And that all sort of squishes it and holds it together like a piece of spaghetti getting shoved out. So these are very fragile. They're not going to hang on long. They blow off in the wind. They wash off in the rain. So just because you don't see them does not mean there are not ambrosia beetles. But if you do see them, is a telltale sign that there are ambrosia beetles there. And I will tell you, if you have a tree that has ambrosia beetle attacks of this magnitude, it's a very easy fix. You're probably going to want to just cut it off at the base and put something else in there, because this is a sign that that tree or shrub is basically toast. In pines, it's a little different just because of how their wood is. They don't make the tubes don't come out like that, but instead, pine trees that get affected by ambrosia beetles, it comes out as a really, really fine, what I call sort of wood flour, right? It looks like flour, feels like flour, except it's wood. It's extremely fine sawdust is what it comes out as. So there's lots of different ambrosia beetles out there. They're always around. They're really just going to attack stress trees. And let's talk about one of the examples though. So here's a non-native and invasive. This is the red bay ambrosia beetle, and it carries laurel wilt. If you're anywhere in the southeastern US, you are hopefully aware of this particular disease. Very standard life cycle. You've got that adult female, she's going to attack the tree. You see mass attack in the middle there. On the right, you can see a larvae feeding on the fungus. That is that dark color that you see inside the galleries. In this case, the fungus grows so rapidly in the tree, it clogs a lot of those vessels. So that's why when you scrape off into those, into the middle of the tree, you can see that staining there. So that's that fungus, that dark fungus growing through the tree. And that is a big part of what contributes to that tree's rapid mortality. Any host in the family Lauraceae is fair game for laurel wilt. So especially a lot of the places on the coastal plain may have some of these trees, especially red bays as yard trees. Avocados are one of these things, and there's a whole bunch of other things. Sassafras is one of the most recent ones that's become affected, especially as you get up Kentucky, Tennessee, and there's lots of sassafras going up into the Midwest as well. And here is where laurel wilt is so far. You can see it has gone quite a ways in about 20 years. There's lots of satellite populations in the Western Gulf and up in the Tennessee, Kentucky area. And this is these are cases where they were moved probably by people. Inadvertently, I might add, but should you be so inclined, there's a really cool website that the Georgia Forestry Commission keeps updated. I believe Allison can put that address out, but that is always being updated as we get new confirmations. So you can tell where it is in relation to where you are. So how do we manage laurel wilt? There's really not a great management strategy for it. There's sanitation. If you got an affected tree, you just chip that sucker up and try to kill everything. You can't really physically protect any tree that has this because these beetles are pretty much flying all year round. They'll chew through stuff. Anything a half-inch in diameter or more is fair game. You can treat a high-value tree with something with propiconazole. This is going to stop the growth of that fungus. It's not cheap, and it's got to be done pretty much every year. Insecticides will work by killing the adults, but again, in places where we have laurel wilt and where there would be Lauraceae large enough to save, it's going to be probably almost a year-round thing. Now, this is might change as you get more farther north, where you've got some big sassafras you might want to keep on a town square, your yard, that type of thing. In that case, you may not need to do quite as much of the fungicide, and it remains to be seen if insecticides will be viable as we get farther north. In general, though, for ambrosia beetle management, if you keep the trees healthy and reduce stress, it's going to take care of things, right? Because ambrosia beetles are coming to a tree that is already stressed. Now, if there are, what about chemical treatments? I mean, maybe, but to me, the big issue is if ambrosia beetles are a problem, that means there's an underlying health issue that needs to be addressed. And you can probably use chemical treatments, but really you're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. The problem is figuring out why is that tree or shrub stressed and why do ambrosia beetles keep coming to it? So that's the take home there. So let's go to bark beetles, a close relative. Most bark beetles we have in North America are native, and most of these attack stressed trees like ambrosia beetles. There are certainly some exceptions, especially the mountain pine beetle and southern pine beetle. Mountain pine beetles out west, southern pine beetle is here out east. Bark beetles, a bit different from ambrosia beetles, and they feed on the phloem. So this is that tissue inside the bark that's moving nutrients. I call it the sleeve of life because it's easier for people to remember. It's the sleeve around the tree. The feeding consumes that phloem and girdles the tree essentially, and the trees die from lack of nutrition. So these things are small, right? I mean, this is just some of the bark beetles we have in the southeast. Next to a dime, it's not like the ones out west are a lot bigger, right? So this is your general size for bark beetles. Now, of the bark beetles, there's a couple different types we'll talk about. The first ones are going to be dendroctonous species. This encompasses some of the worst or the most dangerous ones we have in terms of trees. 14 dendroctonous species in North America, and there's a book here that I gave to Allison to have to pass out. Dendroctonous means tree killer. So this is the genus where you will find the mountain pine beetle and the southern pine beetle. This is the genus where the bark beetles live that can actively kill healthy trees under the right conditions. Okay, if you live out west or you're aware of the big mountain pine beetle outbreak we've had since the middle 2000s. It's killed trees from Arizona all the way up into Canada, right? So that's the big one we worry about. Over here in the east, we deal a lot with southern pine beetle. This is, again, these are all native to North America. Here's a fairly massive SPB spot. You can see that it starts from one area and then it spreads out either with the wind or like a donut, depending on conditions. And this particular spot is so big and so old, you actually see a green center. And that's because the trees that were first hit right in that center have since died and new stuff has grown up. Probably hardwoods have grown up in there, taking their place. Could be volunteer pine too, we never know. Southern pine beetle is basically present anywhere in the east where there are, well, in the southeast, especially where there are pines. Recently, then, it has been moving up into the northeast, New Jersey, New York, all the way up into Maine. Just a month or so ago, it was found. So it is no longer relegated to the southeast. It is now what I would call an eastern pest. One of the key diagnostic things for southern pine beetle is that it leaves trees drop green needles when they're being attacked. So if you go out there and there's a bark beetle attack and there's green needles on the ground, especially right on the edge, that is a pretty good indication that there's southern pine beetle there. Like all bark beetles, they will try to dig their way and chew their way into the tree stem. The tree is going to respond by trying to pitch that beetle out by just pumping a whole bunch of sap at it. In some cases like this one, you can see the beetle was able to get through there. There's a hole, so that means the beetle was successful. In other cases, you'll just see a great big glob of sap and there's probably a dead beetle in there. So if you don't see a hole, there's probably a dead beetle in there somewhere. And that just simply means that tree won that particular battle. However, dendroctonous are capable of operating in outbreaks. That's when you'll see mass attacks with these pitch tubes. Each of the pitch tubes don't get very, very large, maybe the size of a marble or so, but there can be just, thousands to hundreds of thousands on a tree. In the case of the southern pine beetle, those galleries are S-shaped. So you've got a perfect S shape here, and right down here is where that female entered and started digging her gallery. And you can see she is right there at this point. After she finishes with her gallery, now the mountain pine beetle, those galleries are more vertical. So you have to, each of them makes a slightly different shaped gallery. Once she is finished creating those wavy S-shaped galleries, she lays eggs, and then those larvae feed perpendicular to the gallery. The larvae feed on the phloem, as we mentioned, and they tend to eat on one end and poop on the other. So you get what we call frass-packed galleries for the dendroctonous. They will leave typically a blue stain fungi, and then when they leave, there's no pitch tube, right? Because they've already fought their battle, and if they're in there developing, those beetles are good to go. They can just leave unhindered. So that's why if you see a lot of what looks like shot holes on the outside of a tree. That's just bark beetles leaving unfettered. Another type of bark beetle that's pretty common, especially in pines, is Ips bark beetles, okay? Many different species, about 30 total species in North America, 4 main species in the Southeast, and I would say there's, you know, a lot more species in the West that are each kind of common in certain areas, you know, certain areas north and south. More or less, Ips all generally look like this. They've got little spikes on the back end of them. So the lame entomology joke is that Ips are a pain in the butt. It is lame, I warned you, but that is a good way to tell them apart from Dendroctonus, because Dendroctonus has a very smooth backside. So if you find these beetles, you can hold them up to the light and you can see the little ridges on the back or that it's smooth. That can give you a good indication of what you're dealing with. These, like ambrosia beetles, Ips bark beetles are very common anywhere there's a pine tree. They generally attack those weakened or stressed trees. In this case, the male starts a gallery and then he puts out a pheromone that calls in the females, and they're particularly disruptive when it's times of drought. And this could be in the middle of the woods, it could be in the middle of town. It doesn't tend to matter. When there's drought, pines get stressed, Ips come in. They're just one of those things that's our main issue when it becomes droughty. Now, generally speaking, Ips are always out there. Typically, they will pick off a branch here or there. You know, we see that as flagging sometimes. If there's any storm damage, these Ips will hammer that stuff. So this was a slash pine in Athens, Georgia, where one branch had broken off and it was absolutely lit up with Ips bark beetle attacks. All the trees behind it in that little stand, perfectly healthy, not a beetle on them. So Ips are a bit different from the Dendroctonus in that when a tree is attacked by Dendroctonus, the whole thing tends to turn yellow, then red, then dead at once. In the case of Ips, the tree can turn in patches, is kind of how I would describe it. You might have a branch that starts out yellowing and then going, and then maybe the little more of the tree, and then finally the whole tree. So it's more of a mosaic of colors that happens, and eventually that tree will succumb. I should also mention trees don't always fully die from Ips. You know, there's times where they might just pick off a branch, and if the tree is healthy enough and can sort of wall that branch off, it'll just kind of move on. So it becomes an issue in places like golf courses where they've got a zero tolerance for dead branches. But if it's a tree in someone's yard where a dead branch is just whatever, it's fine, you may not really need to do much. Again, it's a bark beetle, so you'll get galleries, you'll get pitch tubes. You have boring dust if that tree is lacking too much water and it can't really provide the resources to make sap. Then you'll get just kind of a dust. It's a bit, it's less fine than that of an ambrosia beetle. Now, in terms of Ips, they have many overlapping generations a year. I tend to think of it as like a conveyor belt of Ips. You know, once they get going, they just sort of go and go and go. In some cases, you know, we know Ips avulsus can do 10 or more generations per year in Florida and some of these warm spots. So you're getting just repeated generations. Again, high threshold for heat. And in terms of tree susceptibility, you're looking at pines, and anything that stresses a pine tree, regardless of where that pine tree is, can make it susceptible to Ips. This is storm damage. We see this a lot, especially down here in the Southeast with a lot of the hurricanes that come through the region. There's always a massive pulse of Ips after the hurricane because there's so much either recently dead or almost dead or dying trees or stressed trees. You know, even if they're standing after a hurricane, they've been whipped around so much that lots of broken tissues and the tree just struggles, and we have Ips all over the place. Lightning can call them in or increase the tree's susceptibility. Mechanical damage. This is really common all over the country when there's construction in town and not enough space is left next to mature pine trees, and they try to build right next to them and they cut off too many of the roots. That is a big stressor, and a lot of times then you'll get Ips bark beetles coming in at that point. And then, you know, biotic agents as well. If there's other pathogens in there, that can weaken a tree. And again, I mentioned drought. Drought is non-discriminate when it comes to whether a tree is in a yard situation or out in the woods. It does not really matter. Characteristics of Ips outbreaks, you just get sporadic mortality throughout wherever. Maybe it's throughout the neighborhood, could be throughout the park, throughout the stand. small clusters of attack trees, and these are generally pretty short-lived. And just looking aerially, I showed you that aerial shot of an SPV outbreak. This is what a NIPS outbreak looks like. You just have a sprinkling of dead trees throughout this whole stand, and it looks this way again. 100 acres or in just a neighborhood situation, you'll see a tree here and a tree there. The last group of pine bark beetles I want to talk about is the turpentine beetles. We have a red turpentine beetle and black turpentine beetle here. In the States, these are very similarly similar in a lot of different ways. They are dendroctonous, but they are not nearly as aggressive as their cousins, the southern pine and mountain pine beetle. So and I'll focus on the black turpentine beetle. Honestly, the red turpentine beetle does basically the same thing as black turpentine beetle. It's more just of where they're located. So black turpentine beetle is mostly located in the southeastern US. The red turpentine beetle is much more common out west and up north. You tend to see a little bit of an overlap in the southern Appalachian region, and that's pretty much, that's most of where you'll see the overlap. But these things attack primarily weakened or stressed trees, and a lot of times it's after a fire or some sort of storm or physical damage too, you know, especially in town when they're building. They can cause some mortality during droughts. The pitch tubes for these are massive. They can be a $half size in diameter and stick out an inch. I mean, they're quite large. They don't have a really distinct gallery. It looks kind of like a question mark or a 7. And if you peel the bark off where they are, the larvae often just fall out. It's very different from Ips and the mountain southern pine beetle. If you peel that bark off, the larvae kind of hang in those galleries. Here, the larvae just sort of fall out of there. Very common to get black turpentine beetle or red turpentine beetle pitch tubes at cankers, especially fusiform rust cankers. And now I've talked quite a bit about keeping trees healthy, and that's going to solve a lot of your problems, right? And so this goes for hardwoods, this goes for pines. I'm going to use this as an example of what I mean. So this was a healthy 13-year-old loblolly pine in South Carolina, Aiken County, South Carolina. And so what we did was we stapled a whole bunch of artificial lures to this tree. We have these lures that are different pheromone components for these bark beetles, and it basically smells like there's a bark beetle party, so all the other bark beetles come to it. So we stapled a whole bunch of these up to make it seem like this tree was weak and ready to be colonized, okay? And then we followed what happened after a couple of weeks. And here's what we found. We found that the first beetles that came in were met with an incredible amount of resistance from the tree. Remember, this is a healthy tree, so the first beetle that basically tried to bore into a healthy tree just got engulfed in sap and completely killed. I mean, you don't even see an exit hole or an entrance hole here. I picked that one open and there was a little beetle entombed in there. So the tree won that battle. But because beetles kept coming at the tree, as time passed, the tree response to protect itself was less and less. So here you see there's still a fairly sizable pitch response, but if you look closely, there's a hole right there on the top. So the beetle eventually did get in. And then beetles kept coming till beetles that actually came late faced almost zero resistance. They just drilled their way in and did their thing. So this is a great example of how if you keep your trees healthy, pines or hardwoods, they are going to have a much better chance at fending off a lot of these wood boring things, especially bark beetles. If any of you really want to nerd out, this is a great website, barkbeetles.info. It's run by Tom Atkinson. I think he's retired now at the University of Texas, but bark and ambrosia beetles of the Americas, great information, tons of pictures, all the species are in there. It's a great resource. So general bark beetle management is just keep trees healthy and reduce stress, right? How hard can that be? That said, chemical treatments do work. I know it's a little trickier to put them into pines as opposed to hardwoods, but because the larvae and the beetles eat the green tissue, eat the foam, it is possible to use injectable chemicals to try to either kill beetles that are in there or keep them or prevent them from getting in there. Again, though, if you've got bark beetles, especially Ips or anything that's not a dendroctonous, that is a sign that there's an underlying health problem. And in a lot of cases, you know, anything else is just band-aiding. You got to figure out what is going on. Maybe it's something with the soil, maybe it's the site. Maybe it's just the fact that it's an old tree and it's about to die. And, you know, at some point you just can't do anything because stuff dies. And that's, I think, a point that a lot of clients tend to forget sometimes. Now let's talk about some other types of beetles, the wood-boring beetles. One of the groups is Buprestidae. These are also called the jewel beetles. Very colorful, shaped kind of like a bullet. Lots of species all over the place, but I am guessing the one species you have probably heard of is emerald ash borer. So this is arguably the worst, invasive forest pest of this generation. It's killed millions of trees and cost billions of dollars. The life cycle, hopefully you all are familiar with this by now. The adults will come out in the spring, chew a D-shaped exit hole. They can survive without food, and really all they do is nibble a little bit on the leaf, on the foliage. Damage is negligible. They put a little egg in the bark, and then that thing hatches into this larva. And this is really your damaging life stage, because this is the life stage that feeds on the phloem, right? So that's going to feed at least the rest of that year, maybe 2 years, depending on where it is. These winding galleries are just completely, making that phloem unusable and killing that tree. And then it pupates in these chambers right under the bark. Emerald ash borer was discovered in 2002 in right around Detroit. And in the last 20 years, it has basically gotten all over Eastern North America, right? I mean, Mississippi somehow has not have emerald ash borer, I should say, has not discovered emerald ash borer. So the joke down here in these parts is that it's either extremely lucky or poor at trapping. We are not sure. Florida has not found it yet either. This makes a little more sense because there's a big swath of Alabama and Georgia where there's not a lot of trees. That's more agricultural land kind of in the middle of those two states. So it kind of makes sense that it just hasn't gotten there. Ash was planted to replace elm, and I say this ironically because, ash was basically wiped out by EAB across this eastern part of this country, and a lot of ash is in urban areas, and a lot of elm used to be in urban areas, and that was wiped out by Dutch elm disease. So any of y'all that have influence on what tree goes into urban areas, I really encourage you to use diversity and not just put red maples everywhere like they seem to have done now. We need to have a more diverse urban tree canopy, and that is going to help for stuff like this when it happens again, not if, when it happens again. Sorry to be a Debbie Downer, but I really think we'll have another thing like this at some point. So what do you look for EAB? Your first key is a declining and thinning crown. Eventually you're going to get these epicormic sprouts. This is a tree's last gasp effort at life. Almost never works. So again, when you see this, you can do a straight pruning cut at the base of the ground and just think about what you're going to put in there next. You get cracking and swollen bark, and sometimes if you look under there, you'll see those back and forth galleries, the D-shaped exit holes. So remember D for Dave. You've got all sorts of winding galleries under the bark, and in some cases, this can really just take over the entire phloem underneath there. And if you're doing a drive-by 70-mile-an-hour diagnosis, if you see ash blonding, we call it, where it looks like the tree has white bark, this is a good telltale sign, because this is from woodpeckers coming in there, flaking off that bark, trying to get at those larvae. Now you can save an ash tree. And I remember when EAB was first discovered, it was a complete death sentence for an ash. One thing that EAB has, I think, forced us all to do is get better at treating trees with injectable or soil drench methods of treatment, right? So you can save some of these ash trees. The whole key is getting to it before too much of that canopy is lost. This is sometimes tricky because trees like this look fine, but they actually have emerald ash borer in the upper parts of that canopy. And by the time you know they're infested, it is just too late a lot of times. But it just takes some good inspection, and be aware of where you are, where emerald ash borer is, and what an ash tree is, and that can help quite a bit. There's also this chemical treatment book that has been put out. This is the third edition of this. It is kind of like the tree treatment Bible for this type of thing. So it gives a lot of great information. Allison has this to pass out as well. So there are several ways, again, to control emerald ash borer and any of those agrylus boring beetles, systemic, basal, trunk injection sprays. It all depends on the client's needs, wants, economic situation. All of that stuff will help you determine what is the best course of action. Another group of wood boring beetles are the Cerambycidae, the longhorned beetles. Now, Of course, our public enemy number one, especially in this part of the world, is Asian longhorn beetle. This is native to Asia, very wide host range. We do have eradication efforts. We're working hard to eradicate that thing. Here is what it looks like on the tree. It's about 1 inch, 1.5 inches long, and it chews these egg niches in that tree. She will turn around then and lay eggs on these things. The eggs are about the size of a grain of white rice. And then once those eggs hatch, they do feed on the phloem. And so when that happens, the tree, and most of this is red maple, about 98% of the hosts are going to be Acer species. Of that, 97.5% tend to be red maple, especially down here. So once the larvae start feeding on the phloem, you get the bleeding on those egg sites. As they get larger, they turn and go into the tree, and you will see sawdust and sort of wood shavings coming out of there. The main damage is from this larval stage, and they just completely Swiss cheese the inside of that tree or that branch. Here's the larva. These things can be almost the size of your pinky, so they get quite sizable. This causes a lot of broken and fallen branches, and this is one of the main issues, because Asian longhorn beetle has no problem being in urban type areas, parks, suburban areas. It's got no problem there. So when you've got something this large falling, you can see that branch in my hand on the left there. And if you look closely, you've got all of these different larval feeding galleries are what contributed to that branch breaking and falling. And then, this is again, from down in the infested zone, you've got stuff just hanging up there. So it makes it very dangerous for people, especially if this is along any type of sidewalk or path. The adults come out in a round exit hole. And because those larvae pupate deep in the wood, you can often stick a number 2 pencil right in there and it will hold. You can stick that in 1 inch, 1.5 inches. The adult feeding is negligible, the damage, they'll nibble on some of those green epicormic shoots. It doesn't really do a whole lot. Again, the larval feeding is the big issue. Can you prevent them? I have yes, but from what we know, the insecticide efficacy is not great, about 60%. And this is in part because the adults may or may not feed. And the larvae really don't spend a lot of time eating phloem. They eat a little bit and then they tend to go into the wood where it's just impossible to kill them with chemicals. So unfortunately, one of the big ways we eradicate this is we just cut the tree down and chip it up. So once a tree has Asian longhorn beetle, can you save it? I have no, because this is a federally regulated pest and it's just the tree is coming down to get destroyed. In pines, we have another longhorn beetle, Monocamus species. These are fairly common as well. Again, a similar type of egg niche as the Asian longhorn beetle digs. It's one of the things some of these cerambycids do. So she will chew an egg niche, a little divot in there, turn around and lay an egg. You can see this here is in one of the egg niches next to an Ips pitch tube. So they're about the same size. If you've been around a tree that is, a pine tree that's dying, you've heard crunching inside there. Sometimes you can hear the crunch, crunch, crunch as you're walking by. Those are larvae from these Monocamus typically, or some other large, either buprestid or cerambycid. Some of these things get quite beefy and you can hear them crunching their way through the trees. Some of the other wood borers we have, there's actually a group of Lepidoptera, the clearwing moths. These are moths that have, as you may have guessed, clear wings. They kind of look like hummingbirds the way they fly, and they can be confused for hummingbirds. They're active right around dusk time usually, so sometimes you'll see them feeding, especially some of the large ones get to be the size of hummingbirds practically. They contribute to tree decline. Now I have contributed. I've never seen a case where these moths actually cause a tree to die, but once a tree starts getting stressed, again, here's that stress issue, right? They will come in. So here are 2 trees that were starting to die. This is over in Arkansas. Closer inspection, you see some of those pupal casings hanging there. There's one right there. This is a very telltale thing. If you see a pupal casing just hanging out of a part of that stem or branch, that is a clearwing moth. So the moths will lay their eggs on the bark. The larvae will feed on the phloem and in the wood, and then they will come when they're ready to emerge. They crawl out of there and they leave the pupal case right there. So that is a good way to know that you have them. And then finally, Hymenoptera, we have sericids, the wood wasps. This is Tremex columba. This is a very common wood wasp you'll find on hardwood trees. Wood wasps are extremely weak secondary competitors. They are not going to attack a healthy tree. wood wasps come to trees that are already sick. One of the, we have the Syrinx noctilio up in the northeastern part of the US. This is an invasive wood wasp that gave us all sorts of consternation about 20 years ago or so, the early 2000s. We thought it would completely take over the country. It has not done that. So it was confined to some spots in the northeastern US and Canada there. But again, wood wasps are not, at least in North America, they are not primary tree killers. They attack trees that are weakened. They attack trees that are stressed. So general wood borer management, again, keep those trees healthy and reduce stress, especially for hardwoods. Those chemical treatments do work. But again, for a lot of these things, if you have wood boring pests that are not one of the big invasives, right? It's not EAB, it's not ALB, it's not red ambrosia beetle. It's not, you've got some of those aggressive ambrosia beetles, Uolacea in California. If it's not one of the big invasives, then the wood boring beetles are a sign that something is wrong with that tree. And the key is going to be figure out what is wrong with that tree and can we fix that? Because if you get that fixed, it'll take care of the other beetle problems. With that, I am ready for any questions, Allison.
Cool. Thank you, Dave. I always appreciate your energy whenever you speak. So we do have some good questions. Okay, so you mentioned laurel disease, right? You're talking about laurel wilt. Does it affect the mountain laurel, the Kalmia latifolia, and varieties?
Oh my gosh, you would have to look up and see if they are in the family Lauraceae, then yes.
Okay.
If they are not, then no. And I don't know what family they're in.
Okay, cool.
But any plant in the family Lauraceae is fair game. I think they are not. I feel like we would have known by now. I think mountain laurel is just one of those unfortunate common names. It's probably not actually a laurel.
Cool. Yeah. So Jeff, if you just want to double check on that, it looks like it would be just a quick Google search.
Yep.
Thanks, Dave. All right. Okay. This is a good one. We've got Ips attacks appear similar to pine pitch canker, which is very common in the Bay Area with Pinus radiata. Is there any way to tell them apart without capturing the physical insect, especially if they're high in the tree?
Pine pitch canker. Yeah. So one of the, if you can see, sometimes if stuff for stuff high in trees, I always carry binoculars, right? And sometimes you can see pitch canker compared to Ips beetles. Ips to me leave more discrete pitch tubes. Okay, and the pitch tubes don't tend to run as much. So this is what my eyes have trained to, but for me, Ips bark beetles, they leave a pitch tube that sort of stays circular, right? And a lot of those cankers, especially some of the pitch cankers, it leaves more of a dripping, like it's been forced out and drips down the tree. That is probably what I would use, especially out there, to see if you can tell. And then also, Ips are going to be like a circle. They're like scattered pitch tubes, whereas the pitch canker is often more drippy in one area, and it might be a huge area, but with Ips bark beetles, you see sort of discrete roundish pitch tubes. That would be probably what I would start with to try to get a better handle on. The binoculars are going to be the key there.
Cool.
And then also, with some of the cankers and fungal diseases, one of the things I've noticed over my years is that when a pine tree loses a branch or limb to Ips bark beetles, the needles turn brown, but they always stay like out, right? So the needles, it's just brown needles that are out. Anytime you get pitch canker, especially, the needles droop and wilt. So they turn brown, but they also droop. So that's sort of my 75-mile-an-hour diagnosis. If I see a pine with droopy brown needles, that's probably fungus. If I see a pine with just brown needles that look normal shape-wise and orientation, that's probably bark beetles.
Cool. All right. And then also, when I got my QAL in 2010, I was told that most borers attack the bottom of the tree, so it was recommended to spray the bottom 6 feet. Is that effective or accurate at all? I think it depends what chemical you're talking about, Scott.
It depends on what chemical and what borers you're talking about, right? Bark beetles, that's not going to do much of anything. So if you're talking strictly hardwood borers, that are native to North America, then maybe. If you're talking bark beetles, no, because they're going to attack, a lot of times for bark beetles, hardwood or pine, if something's a 1/2 inch in diameter or more, it's fair game, so basically your whole canopy is fair game.
Sure.
And often by the time you see, like with EAB, by the time you see damage at eye level, you're like, that tree's hurting already. So it really depends on what you're looking for, what you're trying to prevent. Is it purely preventative, or is it in response to, well, we already saw some sort of borer there? If you've already seen it there, you need to really look at that tree and see, well, is it all up in the tree, or is there just a spot here? And then I would still jump back to, if you've got native borers, you got another issue to figure out, right? And it could be something as simple as you need fertilizer, or it needs more water, right? I mean, we see that all the time when we get these droughty spells. We start seeing trees kick off from all sorts of stuff. I mean, water the thing, and that'll probably handle a lot. And a lot of homeowners especially don't think about that. They'll spend 3 hours every weekend singing to their flowers in the flower garden, but they'll plant a tree and not do anything for 30 years. So I'm not saying you got to sing to it every weekend, but just give it a little bit of attention every year. And you can often do a lot of good in terms of tree health.
For sure. Cool. Thank you. So Scott, if you have further questions on that, I'll put my contact information up too, and we can help talk you through anything specific. And what I will say too, I was going to say this when I put up the code, but Rainbow, we are always going to preach the same cultural practices that Dave was already talking about, right? So if you have any questions on some of those recommendations, please let us know. And then if you are looking for chemistry, we can also help talk you through that. Because like Dave said, there's a million different things that you can use. Just depends on what pest, pathogen, et cetera, you're working with. So we're here to help you through all of those things.
Mhm.
Okay, so we still have a few more questions. Oh, and FYI, mountain laurels are in Ericaceae. So thank you. Yeah, so we're good. And thank you for everyone who knows this off the top of their head.
Yeah, and I will say, in terms of laurel wilt, forest invasive species, our group is most concerned that it's going to move north at this point. I mean, we've got it's in sassafras in Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, lots of sassafras as you move up into that central hardwoods region. And so that is our big concern now. There's been some work done from at Mississippi State, John Riggins, a couple of years back, that showed cold is not going to be a major factor in stopping red bay ambrosia beetle. Like, it's going to probably just kind of keep moving at this point. Yep. So, yeah.
All right. Any other larvae that can be confused for Asian longhorn beetle?
There's a number of native wood-boring cerambycids. So on the surface, yes, but if you put them under a microscope, I think they're fairly easy to tell apart. I've got a couple students doing that right now, and it seems like it's pretty straightforward. But in the field, it can be tricky. One of the ways to tell them apart simply is the time of year and where they are. So at this time, and knowing the life cycle is why it's so important, right? So at this time of year, we know down there in South Carolina, all the larvae are in the middle of the branch or tree feeding on the wood. So if you go to a tree and you see a great big larva right under the bark, well, that's not Asian longhorn beetle. It's just not where they are. So all those things factor together. But yeah, there's a couple things you've got to look at in terms of, where the hairs are on the larva and that type of stuff we do in entomology class back in the day.
Cool. All right. So this is kind of a deep question, but how is Darwin survival of species and die-offs when populations get too high kick in? Is there a COVID for trees? There has to be something.
Is there COVID for trees?
So basically, I think the question is, when populations of these pests get too high and a whole host is threatened, does the survival of species kick in? Which I think this may be more from a forest health view, because in an urban view, in my opinion, I mean, stuff is going to die. It's not going to trees don't sprout in a parkway on their own. So I think urban forestry wise is a little different, but this may be more broader.
I think EAB is a great example here, right? I mean, so there was an initial massive wave of emerald ash borer where populations were really high in places like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, where there's a ton of ash, right? And so EAB populations were super high. practically mowed down all the ash trees, but enough of them didn't die to where the populations of EAB sort of simmer, right? And so now, because ash will resprout, you're getting these resprouters, but we know that once ash is, I mean, I've seen EAB in a 1/2 inch diameter ash, so it doesn't take too long to get a 1/2 inch diameter shoot for EAB to then reinfest, right? So I think what you're seeing is you see this massive wave first, and then populations of both host and insect almost crash to where they both just simmer. And I think now what we're seeing long term is that is going to be sort of of what happens in those areas. Is you've got, you know, ash here and ash that will sprout up, or maybe one will grow, and then you've got just enough EAB to kind of keep their populations going. And so you're going to have this constant sort of back and forth simmer with stuff like that. I think, you know, this is really only going to happen with invasives. The native borer species, you know, there's lots of different defense mechanisms our native trees have, you know, so a native species is probably not going to wipe out a native, I should say a native insect is not going to wipe out a native tree species unless there's some other underlying health factor like a drought or something like that, right?
Cool.
Yeah, so that
Yeah.
would be my hopefully that was deep enough.
That's a really deep question. And I mean, that sounds like it would be like a great thing to talk about in a full like arbor chat type situation.
Mhm.
But thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
So I have put up the CEU course code just out of a concern for time. We still do have a few minutes, but I know some people have things to get to right at the top of the hour. So that is there for those of you listening, PP 22106. But like I said at the beginning, we will submit this for you. So please don't worry about it. This is just for your records. Okay. All right, so now just a couple more questions. Since we're on this topic, chances of EAB getting to the west.
Good.
Yes, it'll be here soon. I live in Portland. We're constantly talking about this. And here's a great plug, I guess. Rainbow has a planning webinar coming up. It's mostly geared towards urban foresters, but we're talking about the 20-year anniversary of EAB and what that means, how folks have handled it. But all of the entomologists have said it will be here. It was confirmed at the border that someone had EAB in their truck at the border of Oregon and Idaho. They kept the cap of their truck closed, so supposedly it wasn't a risk, but you know, if that idiot got caught, there's probably a dozen others out there. So it's really, I think it's a matter of time.
Yeah, and you know, APHIS has since dropped the quarantine for EAB, which basically means, you know, they're putting efforts not into prevention, but I think they're focusing more on biocontrol now. So that just means that, you know, there's no longer any regulations on moving stuff. And because people are good at people, stuff will eventually get brought over there, basically. Yeah. So, yeah.
Cool. All right. Just
matter of time, probably.
Yeah, it'll be here. Let's just, the idea is that we just need to be prepared and take the things that we've learned over the past 2 decades and utilize them in our favor. So,
and on that, I think, you know, if there's any silver lining to having emerald ash borer, it's that as a profession, we've gotten so good at treating trees. All the tree injection techniques that are practically second nature now, that's all because of EAB, right? All the drench technology, all of that stuff is because of EAB. There's now there's in a lot of cases, no reason why your tree has to die from it.
Absolutely.
All the techniques and all the stuff is there. It just takes a little bit of time and effort. And in a lot of cases, you know, people will say, well, I'm not going to spend $200 to treat my tree for 3 years. Well, you could also drop $2,000 and take it out.
Well, and now we actually have scientists who've done a full cost benefit for treatment versus removal and replanting. So the data is out there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like exactly what you said, Dave. It's like, anyway.
It's worth treating. And hands down, it's worth treating. There's plenty of numbers to back that up.
Yeah, so please come to our webinar series. Even if you don't come for the whole thing, it's geared towards municipal arborists, but Rich Hauer gives a really amazing talk on all of that information. So go to our website and sign up for that. At least go to Rich's portion of it, because I think you'll find a lot of value in it. All right, cool. All right, we've got one that's a little bit broader. So if you have to jump off, no worries. We'll send out the recording so you can get this. But if you've got time, Dave, we've got 2 more questions.
Yep.
So can you talk about pocket harvesting or selective tree group cuttings for mountain pine beetle or southern pine beetle? Do you have, I know you're not a
Yeah, I don't
forest
deal.
entomologist.
Yeah, I don't deal with mountain pine beetle a lot, but we do a lot with southern pine beetle. And so, you know, what that is especially for SPB, when we see where that damage is happening, what we tell folks to do is you go to find the edge of your spot, right? So you got to get out there, walk around. That's when you can see those green needles and everything. And then you find the very outside tree that's affected. And then what we do is we take the height of that tree. So let's say that tree is 50 feet tall. You want to cut a green buffer that's 1.5 times that height. So then you would cut a 75-foot tall green buffer outside of the affected area. What that does is essentially create a great big gap around your SPB pocket. And because of the way air moves and microclimate, it basically prevents the pheromones from being attracted, being able to be found by other beetles. So it keeps your pocket right there. And so then we can, you know, assuming the markets are right and you've got crews and all that can come in there, they can take the green trees and salvage as much as they can as that pocket and get that stuff out of there. So that's how we do it down here with SPB. But again, you know, especially down here, thinning is huge. If we keep the basal area of a stand at 80 feet per acre or less, almost no chance you're going to get SPB because you got all that open air underneath there. The wind movement's going to carry that pheromone away. 80 to 120, you're kind of getting in the hot zone, and over 120, we basically call it beetle bait at this point. So that's just, it's the whole key is keeping stands at the right tree density and basal area. So I would assume it works similar for mountain pine beetle, but I haven't worked in mountain pine beetle stuff.
Cool. Yeah, there's some folks out on the West Coast too that if you want to reach out to us directly, we could probably put you in touch with the right resources.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and I don't know what this is in regards to, so hint, if you have further clarification on this. So wants to know the mechanism that leads to tree decline and death. Is it the physical damage of the pest done to the vascular system, or the pathway that they created for entry for pathogens such as a fungi? So I don't know which pest you're talking about, but it could be.
It's yes, and it depends on the pest. So in the case of something like laurel wilt, the tree dies because of two things. The fungus grows so fast throughout all those vascular tissues, and the tree has such basically a violent response to it. Like normally if a tree gets an infection, it tries to wall off that infection and sort of cordon it off. But because that fungus grows so fast and the tree reacts so violently, it basically just walls itself into death, right? So that's laurel wilt. For something like Asian ambrosia beetle, again, they're not feeding on a whole lot of phloem. So it's not like it's taking a whole lot of nutrition moving tissue away, but it's completely Swiss cheesing up all the xylem and is really jacking with the water transport in that tree. And so that's why for a lot of the ALB trees, you just see like a branch will die and then part of the canopy dies, and it almost like it just falls apart while it's still kind of alive because it either physically breaks or it's just not moving enough water. In some cases, it is as simple as you just have an inoculation point for some other fungus, canker fungi, or some of the button root rots, that type of thing. So it really varies depending on what exact system you're talking about.
For sure. Yeah, we've got some of those beetles that just we know vector a fungi that is what eventually leads to death. And sometimes it's because the larvae have fed so heavily. Okay, we've got one last question, then I'm going to call it. So what about felling of trees to throw off the orientation of southern pine beetle?
The way we do that is, you know, what you want to do is you want to fell them to the inside of your pocket. So the whole key with SPB, if you can't cut that buffer, you want to try to disrupt all the pheromones that are going out. Okay, so cutting that buffer is a major disruption, and the pheromone, instead of just going throughout the woods, it just sort of gets blown away at the buffer. But if you can't do the buffer, you just cut stuff to the middle, right? Cut it to the middle, cut it to the middle, cut it to the middle, and then you just wipe it out that way. And that way the pheromone doesn't keep going out into the trees, it just kind of more goes up, or the wind will take it away. So for SPB, it's mostly just about pheromone disruption because they're so, you know, those populations are so linked to pheromone communication.
Interesting.
Yep. And that's
all
just,
right.
you know, if you can't sell the stuff, we cut and leave. but we try, we encourage everyone that possibly can get as much as you can off that timber because it's a good resource.
Okay, this is just a follow-up to that. Do you have
Mhm.
any places to look for research for chemical disruption of the SPB pheromones instead of the cutting?
Yeah, the guy you want to look at is Dr. Brian Sullivan with the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research. He's in Pineville, Louisiana. He is he's the SPB pheromone guy.
Cool. All right. Well, with that, we are over time and we appreciate those of you who are able to stay on. Yeah, we'll send out the link, the recording, all of that. There will be a survey after if you would please leave a review for us. But yeah, thanks for being here. Thank you so much, Dave. Good to see you as always.
You too,
And thanks
Allison.
everyone.
Thanks,
Have a great
everybody.
rest of your day.
All right. Thanks, folks.